Okay, guys, welcome. Today we're going to talk about some basic properties of real numbers. So we're going to talk about some certain closure, commutative, associative, and distributive properties, right? So a lot of these are going to allow us to make some classifications and different important define some important concepts that we're going to need moving forward. So let's go ahead and we'll get started. Okay, so the first couple are going to be ones that we sort of take for granted, and almost a lot of times you don't even realize that they're actually occurring. All right, and the first property, we're not going to do too much with it, but other than state it, but we're going to say that if you take the sum of two real numbers, you're also going to end up with a real number, or if you take the product of two real numbers, that's also a real number, right? And that's what's called closure property, right? So the real numbers is sort of said to be closed in this regard, in the fact that if you take two real numbers and you do these operations, you still end up with a real number. You don't get outside of the real number system. All right. Now the next one is one that's maybe a little bit more familiar, and that's what's called the commutative property. All right, and all the commutative property means is that for addition and multiplication, the order does not matter. Right, so if you take A plus B, that's the same as B plus A. If you take A times B, that's the same as B times A. All right, so that's what we mean when we discuss the commutative property. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to use the commutative property to write each of these expressions in an alternate form. All right, so for example, if I have 5 plus 7, I can also say that that's 7 plus 5. If I have 5 times 7, I could say that that's 7 times 5. For 3 plus negative 6, I could also say negative 6 plus 3. Part D, we could say negative 6 times 3. Part E, we could say 4y plus 3x. And part F, we could say 4y times 3x. Okay, so it's just reiterating the fact that the order in which you add or subtract, which you add or multiply doesn't matter. But keep in mind that if you subtract or divide, then the order does matter. Okay. The next property that we have is what's called the associative property. Okay, so the order, we just talked about a second ago that the order in which you multiply or add numbers doesn't matter. And of course, the same is true when you then group these operations with parentheses, right? So for addition, if you have three numbers that you want to add together, it doesn't matter if you group the first two and add them first, or if you group the last two and add them first, right? And the same is true for multiplication. So for example, if you wanted to write this in another way, you could say this is also 5 plus 2 plus 3. All right, but whichever way you do it, you're going to end up with 10. All right. For part B, you could also say this is 5 times 2 times 3. But whichever way you do it, you're going to end up with 30. All right, for part C, we could say this is 3x plus 2y plus 4z. But if we're not given any of those variables, that's the best that we can do with that, right? We can't simplify that anymore. For part D, we could also write this as 3 times 4 times y, and that would just become a 12y. All right, and last but not least, part E, we could say this is negative 2 times negative 5 and group those together with negative x over here. So these two would give me a positive 10 times a negative x. So together these would give me negative 10x. Okay, so again, these properties aren't super critical to understanding how to do these types of simple examples here, but these are things that we would be allowed to do if we so chose to. Okay, so for example here, when you have 3 plus x plus 5, normally when you would do this, what you would do is you combine like terms, right? This is all something that we've done before, but sort of what's going on behind the scenes is something that's like this. First, you would change this to x plus 3, and then plus 5, and then you're using the associative property to group these together. And then this is becoming x plus 8. All right, so normally we would probably just go to this and sort of take this for granted, but in slow motion, that's really what's happening, right? Just like in part B, you're really going to multiply those two fractions together, and whatever that comes out to be, you'll then multiply by y. So this will be a 6 over 12 times y, which is just 1/2 times y. Okay, and then last but not least, in part C, you would group the -4 and the 7 together, and you get a 2x plus 3. Okay, so that's sort of what's going on there. All right, now this is the one that's probably the most important of the ones that we've looked at, right? So that's the distributive property. So if you have a number outside of parentheses and inside the parentheses you have more than one term, what you can do is you can distribute that a, in this case, to each of the b and the c, and you get ab plus ac. All right, and then it also works sort of backwards here. You would have an AC times BC. Right, and of course you could extend this to more than one term, and we'll learn about this a little bit later on in the course. Okay, so if we wanted to simplify using the distributive property, for example, in part A, we have a 4 times 2x plus 3. So now if we distribute, sort of in slow motion, we have a 4 times 2x plus a 4 times 3. So this would become an 8x plus 12. Okay, in part B, 4x plus 2 times 6, again in slow motion, you're going to end up with a 6 times 4x plus a 6 times 2. So you get a 24x plus 12. Right, in part C, here we just have an additional term on the inside. And here you'll get a 2x plus 10y minus 4z. And in part D, we want to be a little careful here. All right, so we have a minus out front. I typically like to think of this as a -1 sitting out front, and then we'll distribute that. So then we'll get a -2y, and then a -1 times -x will be a plus x. So we get a -2y plus x for that one. Okay, so that is the distributive property, which is probably the one you're most familiar with. And if you'd like a summary of these properties, you could look at page 33 in our textbook. All right, but that concludes this video on some basic properties of real numbers. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.